This video has taken me way too long to complete. This is a long video. I had a feeling it was going to be long, and that's why I hosted this poll asking if you prefer one long video or multiple shorter ones. Most people wanted one long one, so here it is. One long-ass video. I mentioned I was working on a God of War review over a year ago when I reviewed Chex Quest HD. It's taken me a long time. I'm sorry. I did a replay of the classic games as well as played through God of War 2018 in preparation for this video, and 2018 was a lot longer than I was expecting it to be. I have been struggling to put into words just how I feel about this game. I have written like 4 different draft scripts for this thing. I struggled with what to call this video with clickbaity thumbnails. Hell, even with my own thoughts while playing this game. Playing God of War 2018 was a mental roller coaster for me, but maybe not in the way you think. It exemplified a lot of what I don't like about modern AAA gaming, and especially with Sony's current creative focus. I've discussed my feelings about Sony's recent output in the past, and this game was one of the reasons that I feel the way that I do. And yet, I still enjoyed parts of this game. Before I get into the meat of my opinion, I just want to say the devs at Santa Monica are a talented group. The game ran pretty much flawlessly. If you notice any lag or stutters in my footage, I'm not quite sure why, but I had a hard time getting my capture device to record smoothly. So it isn't the games that are lagging or stuttering, it's my footage. I had no issues playing from a performance standpoint. God of War 2018 is a really well-made game, running at a solid frame rate, even if the frame rate is capped at 30 frames per second. Again, I didn't have any weird texture pops or lags or anything like that, and I played on an original base PS4 for this review. I also understand that this game means a lot to a lot of people. A lot of people seem to really like it. I mean, it won Game of the Year for fuck's sake, and I'm constantly seeing people talk about God of War 2018 as having the best combat in the series, the best story in the series, and all around being the best God of War game. If you think it's one of the best games on the PS4, and actually is the best game of 2018, and is the best God of War game, well, you're a fucking idiot. I'm kidding, of course. You're welcome to have your opinions, and welcome to like whatever games you want, but I feel very differently about this game, and all I can speak on are my experiences and my opinions of God of War 2018. In a lot of ways, I hated God of War 2018, especially early on. But as I played and sunk over 80 hours into my playthrough, I actually did enjoy certain aspects of it. Currently, I would say that I don't hate the game. I don't think it's a bad game, though I never really fell in love with it either, and I have some serious issues with it, many of which stem from the fact that I am a fan of the old God of War games. God of War 2018, or God of War 4, or simply 2018, I'll use these titles interchangeably throughout my review, is at times very addicting and rewarding, even, again, dare I say, enjoyable at times. And, like I said, it's an incredibly well-made game, but it's also one of the slowest, most drawn-out, frustrating, tedious, and disappointing games that I have played. If you love this game, and truly think it's the best God of War, with the best story, and the best combat, I am willing to bet one or multiple of the following 3 things. 1. You are a big fan of The Last of Us. 2. You have never played a God of War game before. 3. You have played the old games, but it's been a very long time and you don't remember them very well. Now I know there will be people who don't fit into any of these categories and just legitimately love the game, but I'm willing to bet most of you fit into one or more of these. In order to review this game properly, and really the reason it's taken me so long to write this review, is that I not only want to talk about the game itself, but talk about the series as a whole. Talk about how 2018 fits in with and impacts the other 6 games in the series, and I want to address some of the things being written and said not only about this game, but the older games as well. So think of this video not only as a review of God of War 2018, but also as a series retrospective and community response video. There will be spoilers for all of the God of War games ahead, so you are warned. Anyways, there's a lot I want to talk about, so let's get to it. I wasn't really excited for God of War 2018. I am a fan of the franchise, but I thought Kratos' story ended perfectly in 3. I was very skeptical about the direction that a God of War 4 would go, and in all honesty, I didn't want a God of War 4 when 2018 was announced. As far as I was concerned, Kratos' story ended in 3. the world was destroyed in the aftermath of his quest against the gods of Olympus. I didn't know how they could satisfyingly bring Kratos back, the world back. I was hoping that 2018 would be more of a spiritual sequel instead of a direct one. A game that shared common themes of betrayal, revenge, redemption, fear, and trickery, told as a modern mythical epic with new characters and a different world. But they ultimately brought Kratos back, and at first, while I was skeptical, I was willing to see Santa Monica out and see what they were up to. I am into the Norse mythology setting. I like Vikings and Norse mythology. I'm big into bands like Amon Amarth and Tyr and Bathory and other Viking-inspired metal bands. I did a speech on Norse mythology in college. I watched the History Channel show Vikings. I own a drinking horn and go to Ren fairs and all that. I was about the Viking stuff. Shit, my online name is Nidstang, which is a Norse cursing pole. And since the Greek gods were all killed, it made sense that we'd explore another pantheon of gods in this game. But as more news about this game was revealed, the less interested I became. See, to me, God of War was this badass, mature franchise, spoken in the same vein as like Grand Theft Auto, Postal, and Manhunt, as this taboo game full of blood and sex, and it was reflected in the promo material at the time. The way the game devs spoke about the game, and Kratos during the development of the original games, they'd use terms like badass, antisocial, violent. They'd say things like, God of War will get you laid.
You should play God of War because it'll get you laid. God of War is fucking rad.
I think it's hard to make Kratos more badass than he already is. He's pretty badass. Because that was like the edict throughout the development of God of War 1 was like, anybody who talked to Dave about like, what is this character all about? He'd be like, he's badass. He's badass. You know, he's just brutal, you know.
The mood of the game is dark. The main character Kratos is a very disturbed character.
The things I said to him, I said brutal, nasty, violent, antisocial, pissed off, angry, fuck you. That was my direction to Charlie.
The hardest part about making Kratos was that the storyline wasn't really there yet. And so I was trying to create a character that didn't have that story behind him yet.
I just said, come into work and get angry and see what happens. What they came back with was their versions of anger and the things that they were mad at and the things that, it was really kind of neat because you got to look at the concept art and kind of see how everybody dealt with anger and madness and chaos.
The original God of War games oozed the rule of cool. Kratos was a badass, the story was epic as fuck, and playing the game was an ultimate power fantasy in the same way as games like Doom give off. People today use the term toxic, but I don't think that's fair. I love shit like this, badass dudes being badass, yet it also was a deep narrative, a modern epic myth, full of meaning and emotion. But above all, the devs knew that gameplay was the most important. The original God of War games were made as a response to Japanese game devs who didn't think American devs were capable of making complex action games.
You know, we follow a lot of the Japanese game developers, especially in the early years, mostly because we admired all the work that they had done. And there were several Japanese game developers who said, you know, Western game developers can't make a good action game, so we were like, yeah, we're going to take you guys on. And I think that love of their games just continued.
Yeah, it was a little tough balancing the firebow at first, because you can shoot arrows from far away all the time, but then the things that we've done of like enemies constantly charging you down, it's similar to like the guns in DMC where they do a little bit of damage, and they're good for keeping the action going, because often you'll get knocked out of the way or you'll roll out of the way, and in the past you would just have to run back into the fight. Now you have multiple options.
And using games like Devil May Cry as an inspiration, Santa Monica set out to prove them wrong, creating a game with a complex combat system that was challenging and technical, but also fun and large scale. And they knew that the marriage of gameplay and story was important.
Sort of double-sided nature of the gods, sort of two-faced nature, they're kind of petty ways that they deal with people. So we're really allowing the character development to happen in the gameplay. So it's not just, hey man, we're going to show a movie, look at all this stuff that's happening, you know, we're really kind of like, the player's going to make all these deliberate decisions within the gameplay that kind of twist and turn their path that they're going to end up on.
And that kind of is pervasive not only through the story and the things that he's going through, but also in the moments in the gameplay that you're actually doing. Like, we have a cinematic, you hop on the Pegasus, and the cinematic, you just go It's like, well, that's stupid. You know, that's the whole point of what we want to do with this game is don't just show it, do it.
Why do I bring this all up? Because I don't feel the same badass epic feeling from much of God of War 2018. And it certainly wasn't reflected in its promotional material. In interviews, words were thrown around like mature, grown up, intelligent, meaningful. Journos were putting down the old games, describing them as one note. The story for this one was described as a script, more akin to a movie than a game, as if movie scripts are somehow superior.
My agent had called me, and I wasn't really sold on auditioning for it. I know it sounds silly now. She's like, look, just read it. Just read the sides. And I read the sides, and I called my agent back, and I said, I thought you said this was a video game.
And looking at it as an actor, I hate to use the term one-dimensional, but from an emotional standpoint, it was. So when I looked at this script, and I think one of the first days that we met, one of the first things I said was, like, this is like a script. It's not a game script.
Right.
It's a script. It's a fleshed out story with fleshed out characters that run the gamut of full emotional ranges.
There was the Dad of War memes, and it just seemed to me that the emphasis and direction of this game wasn't where it should have been. God of War 2018 was feeling less like this epic-scale action game with badass characters and satisfying gameplay, and more like The Last of Us featuring Kratos, and I didn't want that. So I waited for reviews. Game journals, of course, loved it and praised it in the same way they do The Last of Us, commenting more on the introspective, feelsy story than the gameplay. I started seeing people speak negatively about the original games, as if they were these dumb, basic, one-note games with simplistic gameplay and non-existent story. The discourse surrounding the game at release just irritated me, and it felt like this was a God of War game in name only. But my friends were saying I was missing out and didn't agree with my negativity, so I said fuck it, found a copy of God of War 4 on eBay for $10, bought it, and now here I am. As I've already mentioned, right off the bat, I didn't really like this game. It does not leave a good first impression, especially after I had just finished the other 6 God of War games back to back to back prior to starting up this game. The title screen was such a stark contrast from the rest of the series. The intense stare of Kratos and blaring soundtrack were gone, replaced by Kratos standing in front of a tree with ambience playing. Reload the game and Kratos isn't even standing at the menu, it's just a title. How boring is that? I feel like Santa Monica really went out of their way to separate this game from the other 6 games. The menu was toned down, the camera was shifted from an over-the-top fixed perspective into an over-the-shoulder, third-person perspective similar to that of a third-person shooter. The original music was nowhere to be heard in this game, the locale was shifted from Greece to Norway, and the gods shifted accordingly. Kratos' voice actor was changed from T.C. Carson to Christopher Judge. Judge does a good job as Kratos, depicting an older, quieter, more stoic Kratos.
Squeeze. This knife was hers. Now it is yours.
But I prefer Carson and his louder, more aggressive depiction, and when I think of Kratos, I think of his performance.
I do not need the aid of the gods! But my path is now clear to me. I will serve them, and they will keep their promise to free me from my past!
Kratos' Blades of Exile were swapped for the Leviathan Axe, a completely different feeling weapon. I think it's a little strange that Santa Monica didn't go the spiritual sequel direction instead of with this follow-up to Kratos' story, considering how vastly different this game is compared to the rest of the series. Not only that, this game is just called God of War 2. No subtitle, no 4, just God of War. Implying that you don't need to play the other 6 games to understand this one, but it's still a sequel, and you kind of do need to play those other games to fully understand this game. The changes were so jarring to me when I started playing this game. Again, I had just finished playing the 6 classic God of War games. Games that I have played and been familiar with for years, since the PS2, and to jump into this, it didn't feel or look or sound like God of War. So why call it God of War? Credit where it's due, God of War 2018 provided some really good, robust setting options. It had settings I really appreciated, various HUD settings and accessibility settings, which are cool. They offered the ability to turn off health bars, which I initially wanted because the original didn't have health bars and I wanted an experience more akin to the classic games. But I quickly learned that health bars are pretty necessary in 2018 as they showed enemy levels and helped prioritize targets. The combat is really different than the classic games, and it took me a long while to get used to it. Best of all, there are different control options, and I was able to change my controls to something that felt more like the original games, with square being a light attack and triangle being a heavy attack. It's not perfect, the controls are still really different than the original, but it was more natural and familiar feeling to me. Call me old school, but using the face buttons for action games feels more natural to me than the triggers. The game starts off and we're chopping a tree, and then we're slowly walking this tree to our house. I can't look behind me. Kratos turns with what I'm looking at. Okay, that's weird for God of War. Walking and talking, yeah, God of War game starting off with a walking and talking section. This is going to be a long game. After close to 20 minutes, we finally get our first combat encounter. 20 minutes to get to the first real bit of gameplay. You should know by now, I'm not the biggest fan of scripted walkie-talkie sections in games, and I especially don't want this kind of shit in God of War, especially when the other games always started off with such a bang. Let's compare the start of God of War 2018 with the rest of the 6 games. God of War 1 has roughly 1 minute and 10 seconds of cutscenes setting up the game, and we are brought into combat immediately. God of War 2 has roughly 2.5 minutes of cutscenes, and then we go into combat immediately. God of War 3 has about 3 minutes and 20 seconds of cutscenes, and then we go into combat immediately. God of War Chains of Olympus has about 1 minute and 20 seconds of cutscenes, and then we go into combat immediately. God of War Ghost of Sparta has about 2 minutes and 10 seconds of cutscenes, and then we go into combat immediately. And lastly, God of War Ascension has like 2 minutes of cutscene, and then, you guessed it, another minute of this weird scripted sequence, and then we get into combat. Just as an aside, I have a lot of issues with God of War Ascension 2. It suffers from walkie-talkie sections, poorly placed camera, lack of sex minigame, and dumbed down simplistic climbing, but at least the combat, enemy variation, and story are all still good in that game. So yeah, the longest we go before combat in the old God of War games is roughly 3 minutes, but 2018 pushes it close to 20 fucking minutes. Why? That is way too long for a game to start off like this. An action game, which is something I'll bring up when I get to combat, but 20 fucking minutes. This type of shit kills repeat playthroughs for games for me. What should be a short, skippable cutscene is stretched out into this boring as fuck walking section that I will 100% want to skip if I ever replay this game from the start. And these sections are thrown all throughout this game. I don't give a fuck about this tree, I don't give a fuck about this pig. This shit should be a cutscene. Even if I can't skip it, at least I can go take a piss or something. Fuck. There are other examples of the walkie-talkie cinematic narrative infiltration as well. There's no jumping. No jumping in a God of War game. A game known for its complex combos, including aerial combos instigated by jumping, and for having platforming sections. There is no jumping, and as such, there are no platforming sections. The game auto-jumps for you when jumping small gaps. Just press X and the game jumps for you. Why? Do the devs really think we're this fucking brain dead? You can't fail these jumps. It doesn't require any skill or precision. Old God of War had basic platforming sections. You had to time jumps, balance on beams, and climb stuff, but not this game. Speaking of climbing, that's dumbed down too. Similarly to how it was dumbed down in God of War Ascension, but at least that game had QTE moments. This game is just hold the stick and you'll auto-climb. Again, it requires no skill. There is no combat while climbing like in the old God of War games either. It's all severely dumbed down from the old games. I played all the other God of War games on their hardest difficulty that was available at the beginning of the game. For the original games, it's the equivalent of hard, since very hard needs to be unlocked. With 2018, the hardest difficulty available at the start is Give Me God of War mode, which is the equivalent of very hard, but what the hell, I'm pretty good at games, I've played enough God of War, who cares if it's got a new camera perspective? Besides, this game is supposed to be more cinematic than action, right? How bad can it be? Oh, fuck. Okay, so starting off on Give Me God of War mode may not have been the best decision. See, the other difficulties have their differences, enemies having more health or doing more damage or whatever, but Give Me God of War has mechanics changes on top of damage changes. Enemies can level up in mid-combat, healing themselves and giving themselves more defense and damage output. Enemies can counterattack immediately after getting hit and can attack through your attacks. They don't falter as easily. Spartan Rage is filled slower and does less damage. Enemies are less affected by status effects, while Kratos is more affected by them. On this difficulty, even the basic starting enemies can kill you in just a few hits, and when you're used to the old God of War combat, this is very jarring. It took me a very long time to get used to how different this game was, like hours, before I started getting a grasp on the mechanics, leading to a lot of deaths. I eventually mastered this game's combat, I stuck with it, and played through the whole game on Give Me God of War. I was not going to play through that 20-minute walking section again. But it was painful, and this game was much, much harder than I was anticipating, but again, I mastered it and its combat. And I like hard games. Getting through a challenge after getting pissed off and frustrated is actually very fun and rewarding for me, so I actually do like and appreciate how difficult this game is on Give Me God of War mode. Aside from climbing and platforming, this game doesn't hold your hand, and that is a good thing. A very good thing. That said, I don't think the combat is as good in God of War 4 as it is in the classic games. So I guess now is a good time to take a look at the combat in God of War 4. At face value, the combat system seems to be at least somewhat similar to the original games. You have a light attack and a heavy attack, which can be mashed off to pull different combos. You get experience for killing enemies and completing quests, which can be used to upgrade your weapons and eventually special moves, called runic attacks. You start with the Leviathan Axe, which has the mentioned basic light and heavy attacks and special moves, but also can be thrown and recalled a la Mjolnir. You can only have 2 special attacks equipped at a time, and their use is locked to a cooldown, so you don't have a magic bar to manage, and it makes combat slower because you need to wait on these cooldowns. Being restricted to only having 2 at a time is kind of annoying, but I can see them being abused in normal fights, so I understand why it was balanced in this way, but I would have preferred a magic meter to cooldowns. These runic attacks can be leveled up to be even more powerful, but in my opinion, it takes away from experimenting with different runic attacks. Why would you ever switch to a weaker underleveled attack? Some of these attacks have the same stats too, so it really comes down to a aesthetic preference. There were also some moves that I just never used at all because they didn't seem useful or indicative of my playstyle. You eventually get, spoiler alert, the Blades of Chaos, which, nitpick time, why does Kratos have the Blades of Chaos and not the Blades of Exile? Kratos loses the Blades of Chaos in the first game, when Ares destroys them. He is then given the Blades of Athena, which he uses until the third game, where he acquires the Blades of Exile. So he should technically have the Blades of Exile, not the Blades of Chaos. But I get it, the Blades of Chaos have the more memorable name, they're from the first game, so they brought them back. Alright, whatever.
These are the Blades of Exile.
The Blades of Chaos work similarly to the Leviathan Axe with their own light attacks, heavy attacks, and runic attacks, but are faster, whereas the Leviathan Axe is stronger. And instead of throwing the blades like you do the axe, you can hook them into enemies to throw them or pull them towards you. And you can also fight unarmed. Unarmed is weaker than the axe and blades, but you increase this meter where you can finish enemies off quicker. But you also can't use runic abilities. These finishing moves are fun, but they don't really give you any benefit other than killing an enemy faster, which is another disappointment. I feel like you should be rewarded health or cooldown or something for pulling off finishing moves. Sort of like glory kills in Doom. I mean, the older games rewarded you with health, magic, or more XP for pulling off finishing moves. 2018 also took out the QTE minigames from the classic games, a crime in my opinion. Even for bosses, it just shows a mini cutscene of Kratos killing them instead of a QTE. Holy shit, is 2021 the year we think back fondly of QTEs? Remember when everyone hated those? Oh, how things change. Like I said, there is no jumping, so no aerial moves or combos. There's no grappling either, other than simply pulling enemies around with the ranged blades attack. So that whole area of combat is missing as well. The combat as a whole is much slower and something that I don't prefer. You won't be pulling off combos in the hundreds. Not that it really matters because experience does not reflect your performance. You get the same experience whether you struggle through a fight or expertly finish it. You don't get more experience for pulling off insane combos or finishing off enemies like in the classic games. It's all arbitrary. You can't swap between weapons very quickly either due to slower swap animations, meaning strategically speaking, you mostly switch after you finish using your runic attacks on one weapon to use the runic attacks from the other, instead of swapping mid-combo to extend a combo or shift momentum. Switching between weapons just doesn't flow as nicely as it does in the older games. It doesn't quite feel as fluid. The camera is absolutely horrible too. You can't see behind you while you're fighting. The camera always follows Kratos' shoulder. It's incredibly hard to get a bearing on what is going on around you. I always got hit by bullshit that I couldn't see from off screen. I know a lot of people don't like the fixed camera thing nowadays, but look at how much better this camera works for combat. You can see the whole arena. You can easily see behind you and anticipate attacks. And it's, ironically, more cinematic too. At the very least, I wish the camera was a little more free so that I could zoom out and see more of the arena without it always being up Kratos' ass.
It was very deliberate going with a new weapon because we're going with a whole new way of controlling the game. You know, we are shifting everything to a whole new set of buttons and a whole new way of interacting with the controller. And I think if we had something too familiar, you would start going to the old standby, square, square, triangle, and why doesn't that work? Old standby, square, square, triangle, and why doesn't that work? Old standby, square, square, triangle.
So as a whole, the combat is much slower and more simplistic from the old games, which is disappointing. Yet I see a lot of comments and reviews saying that 2018 has the best combat in the series, so I need to ask you, why? I cannot for the life of me figure out how somebody could get to that conclusion. Is it because you can roll away? Oh wait, old God of War had that. Is it because you can block? Oh wait, old God of War had that. Is it because you can parry and reflect attacks? Oh wait, old God of War had that. Is it because there are different enemies that require different strategies to defeat? Oh wait, old God of War had that. So really, do you just like that combat is slower and quote-unquote weightier? Because when it comes down to the combat experience, the original games are just much more complex, interesting, and fun. The combat is just flat out better in the old games. I see a lot of people claiming that the old God of War games were just mindless button mashers with no complexity or depth. But they really weren't. And honestly, God of War 2018 is more button mashy than the classic games. I feel like some people have it in their heads that the classic God of War games were like Muso games or something. A mindless hack and slash like a Warriors game, where the fun comes from mowing down large numbers of enemies over pulling off complex combos and learning combat systems. God of War was never this. God of War has a complex action system more in line with games like Devil May Cry and Bayonetta. It requires you to learn it to pull off longer combos, and rewards you for learning the game's combat system with more experience, letting you learn new moves, giving you the ability to pull off greater combos. I mean, sure, on the easier difficulties you can get away with just mashing buttons, but you can say the same thing about 2018. Let's take a look at God of War 3 for a second, which is my favorite game in the series, and I think has the best combat. In God of War 3, you have 4 weapons, which can be swapped on the fly, even mid-combo. Each weapon has their own unique combos and special moves. Each weapon has a unique magic ability that can be used as well. The Claws of Hades have 10 different monsters that you can summon, making its magic ability even more complex and strategic. What do you want to use? Something that summons quick, like the Cerberus and attacks in front of you? Or do you want to use the Siren, which takes longer to cast but deals AoE damage around you? Or do you want to use the Gorgon, which instantly turns enemies in front of you into stone, allowing you to instantly smash even difficult enemies, but then you can't get off long combos, meaning you're losing out on experience? You also have 3 items which can be used in combat with different effects: a Apollo's bow gives you range and the ability to burn enemies. The boots of Hermes lets you run through enemies, giving you a way to engage or retreat. The head of Helios lets you blind and stun enemies, giving you an edge in combat. Then you also have the Sword of Olympus, which is used during your rage mode and has its own moves and combos. You can block, roll away, and reflect with the Golden Fleece. You have your basic light and heavy attacks, and you also have the ability to grapple, which gives 4 different options for how you'd like to deal with that enemy. Run them into another enemy, stab them for orbs, throw them away, rip them in half, and above all, you can jump, meaning you can launch enemies into the air and get a whole other set of combos and special moves. And you had incentive to experiment with different moves, weapons, and abilities, as pulling off more complex combos meant more orbs for better upgrades. Does this sound like basic button mashing to you? On the flip side, God of War 2018 grants you 2 weapons and the ability to fight barehanded. They have a small handful of special moves and no real combos. Comboing doesn't really matter anyways, because unless you get enemies stuck in a falter loop, they'll just attack through your combo anyway. You have a handful of runic abilities to pick from, but you need to limit yourself down to 2 at a time per weapon, and their use is limited as you're locked to a cooldown. You get no external items to use other than Atreus' bow, which admittedly does have 2 different types of ammo that you can switch between on the fly, which is nice, and a talisman that you can equip that also works on a cooldown. Fights basically boil down to opening up with whatever runic abilities you have, then smashing square or triangle once you get a brief opening, dodge if the enemy's attack is red, parry if it's yellow, and run around while the runic attacks refill. They stripped away jumping, aerial combos, grappling, items, magic, and a bunch of the combo focus and resource management in favor of parrying, cooldowns, and literal button mashing. I mean, look at this shit. Hold square to win. This all falls apart when dealing with large mobs of enemies too, because you're constantly getting attacked from off-screen. Fighting with the horrible camera, getting killed because another enemy just attacked through your combo. The notion that slow, parry-focused combat automatically equates to more complex combat is just weird to me, especially when you're comparing it to something like classic God of War's combat. Comparing the combat systems in God of War 2018 to classic God of War can best be described as passive skill versus active skill. What I mean by that is the classic God of War games encourage active skill-based playing, that is, active participation by the player to pull off skillful play. Playing better, pulling off better combos, and learning the game's systems rewarded you with more experience points used to get more better attacks. You are rewarded with these new moves, but you still need to learn how to use them properly. You are an active participant in the game's combat system, and mastering these systems gives you better attacks, makes combat easier, and makes combat more fun by letting you pull off complex combos in flashy, spectacular fashion. 2018's combat system is passive. Your personal skill level doesn't really matter, with some exceptions, which I'll touch on later. Pulling off a flashy combo doesn't impact the game's experience system. It doesn't actively encourage you to get better and get more experience and pull off better combos. It is a passive, armor-based combat system, where you don't need to get tactically better as long as your armor is better. It's 2 very different gameplay philosophies behind the combat design. And this is where I think people may perceive 2018 is more complex. The game is more of a light RPG, or an action RPG, than a true action game. The focus is less on the combat and combat systems, like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta or the original games would be, and are instead focused on your armor and gear stats, armor level, and runic attacks, gems, and talismans equipped, like an action RPG like Demon's Souls or Kingdom Hearts would be. So the focus of combat really comes down to making sure you have the best armor and gear before a fight, more so than the combat itself. Having the right armor and gear in this game can literally be the difference between struggling through a fight, even getting one-shotted, and a manageable challenge, even being able to breeze through some fights. Your armor level is important, and fighting enemies with higher level than you creates a frustrating experience where you will die a lot as you attempt to chip away at enemy health over drawn out combat encounters. But I would argue that that makes the armor and gear system strategic or complex or whatever, not the combat system. Active versus passive. And this is why I hated this game early on. It was a chore to play until I started getting good armor and gear. It was brutal to start off. Basic starting enemies could annihilate me really easily. I died over and over and over on some of these early levels. Side quests felt impossible starting off. I didn't know how to start finding better gear. Once I started getting better gear, then it became a challenging but manageable experience, and I began to enjoy aspects of the game for what they were. I still preferred the original combat, but I accepted and appreciated God of War 2018 for what it was. I went into this game expecting a God of War experience, an action game where I could overcome the challenge by learning the game and mastering its combat. But what I got was a light RPG experience where my gear and armor level became the important aspect of surviving combat encounters and being able to do real damage to enemies instead of monotonously chipping away at their health. That said, I do like the enemy variety in this game. Similar to the old God of War games, there are a number of different types of enemies you can encounter which have different movesets that make combat more interesting. There are Druger, Revenants, Ogres, Travelers, Ancients, Trolls, Wolves, Wolvers, Hazelworms, Nightmares, all inspired by different elements of Nordic and Germanic mythology. Most of these enemies are fun to fight and add some variation to gameplay, but fuck the Revenants. They're just annoying as hell to fight. They teleport all over. You need to stun them with Atreus' arrows to even hit them, and I hated every time I had to fight one of them. I also did like the boss fights and mini-boss fights. The first couple trolls were annoying pains in the ass, but after a while the mini-bosses and bosses became my favorite parts of combat. One-on-one fights are really where the combat in this game shines, especially with the bosses, because learning enemy attack patterns, learning when to dodge or counter and all that is actually pretty fun, like a rhythmic dance. And being able to lock on and focus on one enemy alleviates some of the issues with the terrible camera. When a group of enemies attacks you, it becomes a clusterfuck. But these one-on-one fights, especially against bosses, are enjoyable, even if I do prefer the classic combat. When you get into a groove, those feelings of badassness really come through. Climbing, lack of jumping, camera, and changed combat aren't the only things that are vastly different from the original God of War games. There are a number of other various gameplay changes to this game. For one, the game is open world instead of more linear levels or an interconnected series of levels. The world is huge, with multiple realms to explore, each based off different realms of Norse mythology. There are side quests, challenges, optional bosses, chests to open, and puzzles to solve all throughout the world. I'm not the biggest on open worlds. That isn't to say I hate all open world games. I like quite a few, and while I definitely feel like there was some bloat in certain areas of this game, as a whole, I didn't hate the open world, though I do think it detracted from the narrative, and I found traveling throughout it to be slow, boring, and tedious. You spend so much time in this fucking boat. It really gets annoying after a while. There are these fast travel gateways you can unlock eventually, but those take a while to get you from point A to point B too. You need to watch this brief thing as they build, pick your place, watch as it opens up, then wander around the realm between realms waiting for another door to open, and then you get to your destination. It's the longest fast travel system ever, but at least it's quicker than using the fucking boat. My favorite parts of this were the interactions with other NPCs. It just added some much needed life to the world this game is trying to showcase, which otherwise feels sort of barren. This is something I will touch on more in a little bit. Some of the side quests I liked and found to be really fun, others I found to be a bit tedious. I guess this can be said about any game with side quests though. Some included opening realm tears to kill enemies that spawn in or kill mini-bosses like trolls and ancients. Some involve talking to ghosts and helping them in tasks so they can rest, usually finding an item or breaking a statue or something like that. There are side quests for freeing dragons too. The realms you can travel to include Midgard. This is the basic Earth where humans live. It's the center point for all other realms, and the majority of the game takes place here. It's the main hub, in a sense, where you have the most freedom to explore and interact with the world that the game presents. Elfheim, this is the realm of the elves. There are some open world aspects to it, but it's really more of a level. Helheim, the realm of Hell. This is where those who die unworthy deaths reside instead of being brought to the glory of Valhalla. This realm is cold and bleak and full of ice-type enemies. Jotunheim, a realm of the giants and ultimate final destination of your journey. Midgard, Elfheim, Helheim, and Jotunheim are the only realms needed to be traveled to for the main story. Then you can also travel to Muspelheim, the realm of fire, which acts as a challenge world with increasingly more difficult challenges, giving you the opportunity to win rewards. And Niflheim, the mist realm, which basically provides a roguelike experience as you travel a maze to earn crafting items while avoiding a time limit in poison mist. Asgard, realm of the Aesir gods, Vanaheim, realm of the Vanir gods, and Svartalheim, realm of the dwarves, are inaccessible in this game. We'll probably visit those in later installments. There are some interesting changes to the adult content as well. The nudity and sex from the original games is gone. I was expecting this, I don't really care. I don't think the lack of sex minigame really hurts this game. I wouldn't have complained if there was one, but I also don't really miss that it isn't there. However, I do feel like the blood and gore of this game were really toned down. There's barely any blood for the action going on, and if there is blood, you can barely see it. The game takes place in the Norse lands, the land of ice and snow. We should be painting these snow-covered fields red, and yet there's barely any blood. And much of the blood we do see is like this neon orange lava-looking substance. The God of War games were always known for their blood and gore.
Getting blood on Kratos' body for the first time, which as soon as we got that in, made perfect sense. Like, why haven't we done this before?
We'd see massive amounts of blood fountain from enemies when they'd get hit. Kratos was cutting open Gorgons, spilling Centaur's guts, and ripping people in half with his bare hands. He ripped meat chunks off Hades, and we saw him rip off Helios' head, all the stretchy muscle and sinews ripping as he pulled. It was badass. And in this game, it cuts away when he slices Mimir's head off. What the fuck? Where is my gore, damn it? They traded in the gore for language, though, especially from Brock, the dwarf, who throws fucks and D's nuts jokes around like it's going out of style.
So weird. How do you build a piece of armor out of something so...
None yet.
Nanya?
None your fucking business.
I don't remember much of any swearing in the old games, not that I really care, but it's really weird that they cut out the gore and threw heavy swearing in instead, at least in my opinion. Anyways, there's a lot to explore here with lots of different puzzles to solve, enemies to fight, and chests to open. Every realm has their own challenge and reward, and they can be explored at your leisure aside from story quests. Similar to the Gorgon Eyes, Phoenix Feathers, and Minotaur Horns from the classic games, there are chests hidden throughout containing blood mead, which relates to the mythical story of Vasir, a man created as a symbol of peace between the Vanir and Aesir. He is killed by some dwarves and his blood was boiled into mead. Whoever drinks this mead was said to be given the gift of poetry. In God of War, the mead is said to be imbued with rage instead of the gift of poetry. There are 9 in total, and every 3 increases your rage meter. There are also Indun's apples, which, like the Gorgon eyes from the original game, increase Kratos' health when 3 are collected. Indun's apples come from the myth of the same name. Indun grew apples that were the source of the god's immortality, so it makes complete sense that collecting these would also add to Kratos' health. While I do prefer the more level-centric style of the classic games in terms of pacing, I actually do like that I can return to previously played areas in 2018 due to the open world. It does make exploration a little bit easier and lets you find treasures you may have previously missed, whereas in the originals you would have had to restart the entire game if you missed a power-up item, which is really annoying. The sheer amount of things to do and scale of 2018 results in a really long game though. A game that's a little too long in my opinion. It took me over 80 hours to finish. That's taking into account that I did most of the side quests and I killed all of the Valkyries. So I am willing to shave off like 20 hours to account in for side quests and deaths. The original games all took me around 12 hours-ish to finish on average. So with 6 games, that's roughly 72 hours or so. I spent more time on God of War 2018 than I did on all 6 of the other games combined. But I feel like the older games were more streamlined and focused, whereas God of War 2018 definitely had some bloat. Some of these side quests feel samey, and some of the mini-bosses are the same thing over and over. It gets a little repetitive. I also mentioned it, but there's way too much travel time and downtime, and I feel like this game could have been halved, and the pacing could have been better overall. I do actually prefer games on the shorter side. 15 to 30 hours is kind of my sweet spot. I don't mind games going longer if I really like them, like Hollow Knight and Kingdom Hearts are long games that I love every second of, and if a game is good, I will replay it over and over again, like how I logged 190 hours into Doom Eternal, but God of War 2018 just felt too long to me. After a while, I was just like, let's get on with it already. And some of that is due to the story, which I will touch on when I get to the story, but yeah, I do feel like there was some room to trim in this game. Gameplay is not the only thing to see a severe overhaul. The world, background, and tone had also seen significant shift away from what the originals portrayed. That is, the world that you play in, the world we are expected to be immersed in, the world that these characters are supposed to live in. The older God of War games provided an interesting setting for a fantasy action game. Instead of being whisked away to a wholly fantasy world like Elder Scrolls or Lord of the Rings or something, this game took place in a fantastical version of real-world Greece. A Greece that could have existed had the gods of Olympus actually existed. We not only see depictions of places from mythology like Hades, Elysium, and Atlantis, but also real places like Sparta, Athens, and Attica. These places are obviously heavily fantasized, mixing realistic stone architecture reflective of real Greece architecture with enormous temples, advanced technologies, and magic provided by the gods to create a really cool aesthetic for the games. One minute, you'd be walking through a fairly mundane-looking city, the next you'd be in an enormous temple with giant gears moving giant statues. It was a believable aesthetic that this is what a real-world Greece could have looked like if the gods were real, interfering with everyday life. The world of the classic God of War games feels very lived in, very alive as well. As already mentioned, the levels are full of creatures and characters from Greek myths. Enemies include Gorgons, Harpies, Minotaurs, Sirens, Cyclops, Satyrs, Cerberus, Chimera, etc. You see Hydras, a Phoenix, Griffins, and of course gods from that pantheon. The gods' presence are always felt, and they are fully integrated with the world that you are playing in. You feel their impact, see their temples, and see the effect of their meddling in real time. You also see people. Most of the time they're running in terror as the world around them erupts into the chaos of monsters attacking, or are fodder for Kratos to leave jammed in gears or laid on buttons or something. But we also see glimpses of small towns, markets, brothels, and battles where other humans are engaging in war. Again, it all adds up to create a very immersive and believable living Greek experience. This is a world where the Greek gods are integrated into everyday life. People see the gods, they communicate with them, they build temples to them, they do their bidding, they fight with them and fight alongside them. Everyone is familiar with the gods' existence, their personalities, their powers, their betrayals. You see the aftermath of their adventures firsthand. You, Kratos, the player, interact with them. It is a living, integrated Greek myth experience. God of War 2018, on the other hand, depicts a Norse-inspired life instead of a Greek one. In the same vein as the original games, there are some truly magnificent and fantastical elements to the structure of this world as well, with similar enormous towers and temples, advanced technology for the time period with giant statues and gears and all that, and of course a central theme of magic and gods, making a lot of these larger-than-life elements possible. I really like the temple designs, the technologies, the way all these things look and operate and reflect a world that could have existed had the Norse gods actually existed. In regards to architecture and technology, it's on par with the original games, and it really showcases creative and unique level design. It has a more stripped down Norse, pagan, woodsy flair instead of the grandiose stone pillars of Greece, but I think that fits the change in location. The way puzzles are integrated into all this are also creatively done as well and exciting to see. As already mentioned, there are a bunch of monsters and creatures from Norse and Germanic myths occupying the world of God of War 4. Like I already said, Druger, revenants, ogres, travelers, ancients, trolls, wolves, wolvers, tazzleworms, and nightmares. You see elves, dwarves, the world serpent, dead giants, a giant tortoise, Yggdrasil, Valkyries, and some of the Norse gods as well. Just like in the original games, it's cool and exciting seeing the different creatures and characters from the myths and legends come to life in the game. The game also features some really great set pieces. However, and this is a big however, the world of God of War 2018 does not feel as alive or as well integrated with the myths. For starters, there are no living human characters that you interact with in this game. There aren't towns, there aren't examples of civilizations integrated with the Norse myth. The temples are deserted. The only house you see is Kratos's. You see a burned down camp with nobody there. All of the NPCs you come in contact with are important characters from Norse mythology. Freya, Baldur, Mimir, Brock, Sindri, Magni, and Modi. You don't see any examples of a real society integrated with them like you do the original games with the Greek myths. There's a disconnect. Like there's a human world where people hear about the stories of the gods, and then the world of the gods, where the stories take place, as opposed to the classic games where these worlds are one and the same. You don't really see people interacting with the Norse gods. You don't see people familiar with them. Any humans you come in contact with are dead, spirits, the aftermath of a story you don't get to experience or see. And yet, these dead spirits are the closest things we get to an integrated myth world like the original games portray.
Come and face me, God of Thunder!
Your challenges mean nothing to the gods, Spirit. They do not listen.
Do not mock my pursuit of vengeance. Though my family devoted their lives to worshipping Thor, I've devoted mine to his downfall. And I will start with that statue looming over my father's grave.
Unlikely. You are dead.
Is there something we can do?
For a reward, of course.
If you bring down the statue, you have my blessing to loot my father's grave. He rests on an island to the east. You there! Have you destroyed the statue?
The statue stands no longer, Spirit.
Then my bond to this realm is severed, and I am off to find the real God of Thunder. He will know retribution. My deepest gratitude.
Off he goes. Brave guy. Want to look for Thor on his own.
He is a fool.
They're the sole bridge between this quote-unquote real Earth and the mythic world we are exploring. All of the gods, actions, drama, and tribulations have already taken place, far away. And we, the player, get to experience these stories through Mimir's retellings, or by Atreus interpreting pictures of the events loosely related to the places you're at, or Atreus reading them off a slab, letting us read a prose codex afterwards. All the lore, background information, and Norse myths are regurgitated to us information dump style. Like the devs realized rolling around all the time would get really old fast, so they needed to fill up space with Mimir's storytelling. Where the mythic world of the original games felt tangible, present, and still being told, the mythic world of 2018 feels stagnated, in the past, and left behind. It's all an example of showing versus telling. The mythic world of the classic God of War games were shown to you. Yes, many of the stories from the myths had already happened in the past on the old games too, but instead of the characters merely retelling the story to us, we see the story, or at least the aftermath of it. We see cities under siege. We see characters like Midas in relation to their myth. We see and interact with the Labyrinth. We see Icarus, Daedalus, the Sisters of Fate, the Titans, Perseus, the Kraken. and so many other characters in each game. Icarus already has his wings, which we take from him. We see Prometheus chained, and then we kill him ourselves. We see a cutscene of the war between the Titans and gods of Olympus instead of reading about it. Showing these things is so much better than simply telling us the story, and it makes it feel real, like it actually happened in this universe, instead of it simply being a story in the universe. See what I mean? And we still had the statues and brief text boxes describing the myths even more in the old games, but at least we actually see these things. Coupled with the fact that there aren't any real-world locales in 2018 either, just Midgard, adds to a sense of detachment too. Like this is just a generic fantasy world inspired by Norse myths, instead of a real-world Norse region with the gods existing. Again, the real locations of Athens and Sparta and the like really make these games feel like this is what Greece could have been if the gods were real, instead of just a fantasy world where the gods sort of exist like God of War 2018 feels like. I want to reiterate, I don't dislike everything about the world building. Like I said, I really liked seeing the different creatures and characters. I liked the way everything looked aesthetically. I like how different the realms are from one another. It's a really nice touch that makes all these different realms feel really unique. And there are some instances I think that they nailed the myth-telling too. Like when you find Thamir's corpse, or when you go to Tyr's gold room. These are really nice additions that make the world a little more lived in, like these stories actually happen, instead of them simply being stories. So yeah, as a whole, I think the aesthetic elements of God of War 2018's world were done very well, but I don't think the integration of world and myth was done as well as in the original games. But what about the story? Everybody loves the story, right? It's the thing everyone talks about when this game comes up. Well, the story of God of War 2018 is very interpersonal. At its most basic, it's the story of overcoming loss and coming to terms with the truth. Kratos and Atreus must respect Kratos' wife, / Atreus' mother's, last request, and spread her ashes at the highest point of the realms. Of course, conflict occurs along the way, and then finds himself in the middle of a family squabble between Baldur and Freya. Kratos also struggles to relate to his son, Atreus, as Atreus becomes frustrated with his dad keeping secrets from him. Much of the game is interpersonal, small-scale drama between Kratos and Atreus, Baldur and Freya, Sindri and Brock, etc. As the game goes on, eventually Kratos reveals the truth to Atreus that they are gods, resulting in Atreus acting like a complete asshole to everyone. Kratos' conflict with Baldur comes to a head, and eventually Kratos and Atreus make the highest point in all the realms, the highest peak of a mountain in Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, where Atreus is revealed to actually be Loki, and his mother was actually a giant. The story is told with three different, let's say tropes for lack of a better word. 1. It is the tale of overcoming loss, and the emotional turmoil that comes with losing somebody you love and fulfilling their last wishes. 2. It is a fish out of water story, with Kratos coming from another land and not understanding the customs, language, and gods of this new world. Kratos acts as a vessel for the players to become familiar with this new world. As Kratos learns about this new pantheon, so do we. 3. It is a coming-of-age story for Atreus, as he wrestles with the loss of his mother, fights for the respect of his father, and eventually learns that he is a god and that there is a responsibility that comes with that. I found the main story underwhelming and uninteresting. Knowing me, it should not surprise you that I prefer the grand-scale, action-packed epic that is the original games over the slow, personal story of 2018. It's painfully obvious the influence that The Last of Us had on this game, as it tries to provide a slow burn, pseudo-emotional story between parent and child in the same vein of that game. And like that game, I just had a hard time giving a shit. I don't like Atreus. He's annoying as shit, always talking and pointing out the obvious. I know the point was to make him hard to relate to as Kratos struggles to relate to him, but even by the end of the game, I just did not care about him. Above all, with exception of a few scenes, the story of God of War 2018 lacks not only the epic excitement of the classic games, but the nuance and direction as well. There's a lot to unpack here, so I'm going to try my best. The game is somehow overly simplistic in its general story, yet really confusing in its details at the same time. The quest to journey up the mountain feels so inconsequential compared to the other games in the series. Yes, it has some emotional weight for Kratos and Atreus, but I don't think the game does a good job making the player feel that same weight. We don't know their wife/mother. Shit, I don't even remember her name. Did they even ever say her name? It's the least important element of the entire story to me, and yet it's the purpose of the entire quest. It feels insignificant compared to even the side quests in this game. Like, the long journey really doesn't matter. It gets put on the back burner in favor of these side quests way too often too, that it really does feel like the main quest isn't pressing at all. We need to get up the mountain. Only, not really. Let me free this dragon first. Not even Kratos seems to give a shit about it. The pacing of the main quest is so frustrating. Every time you think, alright, we're finally getting to the end here, something comes to extend the game even more. Alright, we're finally on the mountain. Oh wait, there's this black shit we gotta get through first. Okay, we're at the peak. Oh wait, there's this higher mountain in Jotunheim we need to climb. Okay, we have a way to Jotunheim. Oh, no wait, we don't. Okay, we have another way to Jotunheim. Oh wait, we need Mimir's eye. Every time one of these, but wait, there's more, moments happened, I was just like, can we get on with it already? Ultimately, the real objective was revealed to be opening a pathway to Jotunheim, more so than spreading the dead wife-mother's ashes. The more interesting elements of the main story were less about Kratos overcoming his wife's death, and more about Atreus learning about his godly heritage, and even more about the drama between Baldur and Freya. The fight between Baldur was really fun and actually provided the God of War experience that I was hungry for this entire game. Finally facing off against a god in a battle full of spectacle. There's an undead giant controlled by Freya attacking you from the distance. You're jumping and falling all over the place on the mountain, fighting Baldur, running up a giant. Atreus is actually being useful. Kratos and Atreus fighting Baldur in unison was great. This was the definite highlight of the entire main story. The bit after the fight is great too. Essentially, Baldur wants to kill Freya because she made him invincible, thus taking away his ability to feel. Baldur resents her for this. Kratos sees himself in Baldur and knows that he must die to protect Freya, and he kills Baldur. He explains to Atreus that he killed his father Zeus, and that the cycle of vengeance needs to end. Gods need to stop killing their parents. But Kratos essentially continues the cycle of vengeance and violence as he kills Baldur. He becomes the catalyst for the very thing he spoke out against. As a result, the cycle of vengeance continues against Kratos. It's a really nice role reversal. Instead of Kratos seeking his vengeance out on the gods will be seeking their vengeance against him. And that's poetic to me. But this has very little to do with climbing the mountain, Kratos and Atreus' father-son dynamic, or their wife-mother, and after all this, you still need to travel to Jotunheim. It's so anticlimactic to me, to go from this fight full of spectacle and emotion, to just go back to walking up this mountain. Also, I already mentioned I found Atreus really annoying most of the game, but there is a really good moment with him towards the middle of the game too. When Kratos finally reveals to Atreus that he's a god, Kratos has a solid heart-to-heart with him. Kratos explains to him what it means to be a god, and that they should be good gods that help other people. Atreus understands and agrees. He seems to finally understand the responsibility that Kratos was trying to instill in him his entire life. Understands why Kratos was keeping secrets. They share a drink, a liqueur from Sparta, Kratos' homeland, a symbol of Atreus' coming of age, and a sign that Kratos respects and trusts Atreus. It's a really good moment, one that actually makes me relate with and sympathize with Atreus.
We are not men. We are more than that. The responsibility is far greater. And you must be better than me. Understand? Say it.
I will be better.
Lemnian wine, the island of Lemnos, near the place of my birth.
Lemnos.
To a journey's end.
Really? Smells like rotten eggs. Is it still good?
Possibly.
But it's all thrown out the fucking window. Not even 5 minutes after this scene, Atreus becomes a raging asshole to everyone, belittling others, ignoring Kratos, acting like he is more important.
Yeah! We're sick of hearing about little people's little problems!
Why did you speak to the dwarf like that?
Aren't you sick of hearing about him and his brother?
Of course. But it serves nothing to make an enemy of him.
He should know the truth, even if it hurts.
It was needless and unkind.
Truth is more important than kindness.
Your mother would disagree.
She wasn't a god. Let go!
Calm down, boy. You are not ready for this.
I am ready!
He ends up doing something stupid and gets everyone sent to hell. Kratos rescues him, and he immediately 180s again, and is acting all nice again. What the fuck was the point of this? Why do we have this really good heart-to-heart scene only to have Atreus act like a complete dickhead 5 minutes later, only to immediately have him going back to being nice and respectful? It was jarring, it was stupid, and it made no sense. This shit happens over the course of like a half hour. What the hell? And this isn't the only thing that I thought was poorly explained and confusing. From the start of the game, nobody likes the gods, and we know this because every character in the game makes it a point to talk about how they don't like the gods. Kratos' distrust of them is no longer unique, and it begs to question why he feels the need to beat his hatred of gods so deeply into Atreus if everyone else feels that way too. It should just be accepted at this point that everyone hates gods for their own reasons, even other gods. More unanswered questions. Why were Baldur, Modi, and Magni even after Kratos? Because he was a god? Is that literally it? Why weren't the other gods going after him? Odin has been watching him with his ravens the entire game. Baldur's issues were with his mother, not Kratos. So why would he pursue Kratos so hard, and not look for his mother? And why now? Kratos has been here for years. Atreus is like 11 years old now. Was Baldur looking for him this entire time? And if it was simply that he was a god from another land, well, Mimir was technically a Celtic god in this game, a god that came from outside the pantheon. I know he was eventually abused by Odin, but he had stories and adventures as one of the Aesir for a long time before Odin secured him to the tree. So why the immediate hostility towards Kratos from Baldur? This game also really confuses what a god is and how they relate to things around them. In the classic games, it was understood that this is what the world would be like if the Greek gods were real. The Titans created the earth and the gods. Poseidon ruled the sea, Hades ruled the underworld, Helios was god of the sun, Zeus was king of the gods, Aphrodite was goddess of love, etc. And it was all understood that this was universal. We did see some examples of gods and creatures from outside the Greek myths. For example, in Chains of Olympus, we fight the Persians at the beginning of the game. The Persians worshipped other gods. They attacked Attica, and the Greek gods sent Kratos and the rest of the armies to go defend the city. There, Kratos slays the Persian king, after their king makes a comment about the gods of Olympus. I basically understood this that the Persian gods were false, and the gods of Olympus were the real gods with power. We do see some Persian creatures. The Ifrits in Chains of Olympus and Manticores and Elephantors appear in Ascension, but again, I kind of took it that their creatures existed, but their gods did not. Or at least they were inferior to the gods of Olympus.
Olympus has sent a message, and I am here to deliver it.
God of War 2018 takes this all a step further. As I already mentioned, the Celtic gods exist in this universe, as Mimir was originally a Celtic god that moved over to the Norse pantheon. Tyr, the Norse god of war, is depicted as a bridge between gods and creatures. We see references to many other gods in areas of the world including Greek, Celtic, Egyptian, even Japanese. His treasure room is filled with things from all over the world, including an urn which depicts Kratos during his time in Greece. At the end of God of War 3, we see that the world is in ruin. The skies are black, locusts fill the earth, the souls of Hades are escaping, the seas rage. It is implied that the death of the gods brought about the destruction of the world. Essentially, Kratos destroys the entire world, but with the revelations in God of War 2018, it really shrinks the impact of the ending of God of War 3. Kratos didn't destroy the entire world, he just destroyed Greece. This also means the Norse gods didn't rebuild the world following its destruction in God of War 3, as Tyr and all these other gods existed at the same time, because the world was never destroyed. Only this little piece of it. It kind of ruins the end of God of War 3 and sucks away the epic scale of that classic story. So what does this all imply? Are all the gods from every myth from all over the world real and canon in this universe? Does that really make them gods then? Are these gods able to interfere with one another's areas of the world? Does that mean theoretically Tyr could have interfered with the original games and prevented Kratos from killing the gods of Olympus? Does this mean that the gods really aren't creators or rulers of their respective places? Did the gods go to war with one another over territory? It kind of just repurposes the gods as a group of assholes with superpowers, beings with supernatural powers as opposed to creators and rulers. Or if they are creators and rulers, the scope of their creation and rule is now drastically reduced in the God of War universe. And what about all the underworlds? There are multiple underworlds now. Hades, Tartarus, and Elysium exist, but so do Hell and Valhalla. So what determines where people go when they die? What gods they followed? Where they lived? Where they were from? Would Tyr have gone to Hades if he was killed while visiting the Olympians? If a Norseman dies overseas in battle, does he go to that area's version of the underworld, or does he go to Valhalla? Am I thinking too much about this? It's all so confusing and complicated now, and I really don't know what to think of all of it. On one hand, I do understand why the devs went this route with the story. It opens up other avenues for future adventures. It was a simple way to establish that other pantheons exist for this game, but it also just muddles up what the gods are in these games, what their bigger roles are, and how they affect the world that they were thought to have created. The idea of multiple pantheons existed way before God of War 3 was even written. David Jaffe explains it in this interview.
You know, the high level was, and jump in on the stuff I've forgotten, but the high level was basically you kill Zeus in the first couple of minutes of God of War 3. There's a vacuum in Greek. There's a vacuum on Earth because the Greek mythology religion is in shambles. The other religions and gods rush in, Norse mythology, Egyptian mythology, to kind of take over that place now that Zeus is no longer a power. And it really becomes sort of a mashup of Greek and Egyptian and Norse mythology, where Kratos kind of gets to journey to all these other locations. And, you know, it kind of sounds like a toy, but you'd have like Egyptian Kratos and Norse Kratos, and he kills Thor and takes the hammer. And I always love the idea that the reason we have the Sphinx in Egypt is he has used the Medusa head to freeze this creature out in the desert, which ultimately ends up being what the Sphinx is. But ultimately, he ends up getting all the gods to fight amongst themselves, thus ignoring man on Earth. And the way Kratos realizes that you kill gods with finality is that you get people to stop believing in them. So as the gods have ignored man, man begins to turn away from the gods, and that's how Kratos kills all of the gods. And now with all of the gods dead, he uses the blades of chaos. We were going to use the 6-axis, and you were slitting your wrist, and that's how he dies. And the last scene is like sawing a log. The last scene would have basically been two things. There was two epilogues. One was the sort of the controllable wise men going towards the North Star, indicating that even with all that Kratos has done, man always needs something to believe in, something to aspire to, and sort of it was the beginning of the rise of the new gods that we have today, and a lot of people would say are also on their way out. And then there was a second epilogue. There was a second epilogue where ultimately what happened to Kratos, and we had talked about, I know it's been attributed to different people, but the ultimate idea was that the Blades of Chaos were sort of ultimately melted down to become the Grim Reaper's scythe, and Kratos becomes the Grim Reaper.
So, I know this isn't an idea exclusive to 2018, and I can see why they went a different route when they concluded God of War 3, as these are all questions I was thinking as I played God of War 2018, and I never feel were adequately explained. If you think that this all makes sense, and can explain some of these things that I'm confused about in the comments, go for it. But yeah, what is a god but a miserable pile of secrets? God of War 2018 was directed by Cory Barlog. He also directed God of War 2 and was on the team for much of the God of War games developments. David Jaffe, the creator of the franchise and director of the first God of War, has expressed his admiration and enjoyment for 2018 as well. So I don't want to say that the creators of the original games misinterpreted their own game, but I do feel that there was some misinterpretation of the original games in 2018. At the very least, journos and other reviewers definitely misinterpreted the other games and who Kratos is as a character. I constantly see people say that the story of the original God of War games weren't deep, or that Kratos was one-dimensional, or that he was just angry all the time, or that God of War 2018 is showing us a side of Kratos that we've never seen before. He's a dad now, and it's all bullshit. The old God of War games were deep. They were complex, they were emotional, and they had meaning. And I'm going to argue that they were deeper, more complex, and more emotional than this game was. Now I know this is only the first game in a new direction for the series. It's a little unfair to compare one game to 6, but that's what everyone else has been doing. And 2018 is still a continuation of those 6 games, and it ignores much of the nuance, depth, and growth presented in those games. God of War was not about revenge, it was about redemption. God of War was not about anger, it was about fear. Kratos was not one-dimensional. He was a human character who was thrust into a world of manipulative gods. The first God of War begins with Kratos' attempted suicide.
The gods of Olympus have abandoned me.
The gods of Olympus have abandoned me. Kratos is a broken man who wants nothing more than to take his own life. Vengeance doesn't fuel him here. Regret and loss does. Throughout the course of the games and due to more manipulation by the gods, yes, Kratos eventually becomes fueled by rage and sets out on a quest for retribution against the pain Zeus caused him, killing the gods one by one until the world lays in ruin. But that is only a sliver of what actually goes on in these games. Kratos is a man who calls out to Ares in a time of desperation to save him. In return, he lives his life as a slave to the God of War, killing in his name until he eventually is tricked into murdering his wife and daughter Calliope. Seeking redemption, he is told by Athena that if he kills Ares, he will be forgiven for the slaying of his family.
10 years, Athena! I have faithfully served the gods for 10 years. When will you relieve me of these nightmares?
We request one final task of you, Kratos. Your greatest challenge awaits in Athens, where even now my brother Ares lays siege as we speak. Athens is on the verge of destruction. It is the will of Ares my great city fall. Zeus has forbidden the gods from waging war on each other. That is why it must be you, Kratos. Only a mortal trained by a god has a chance at defeating Ares.
And if I am able to do this, to kill a god, then the visions, they will end?
Complete this final task, and the past that consumes you will be forgiven.
Out of desperation, Kratos sets out to kill him, climbing out of Hades itself and opening Pandora's box in the process. Upon killing him, he only wants to atone for his sins and attempts suicide, only to be stopped by the gods and turned into the God of War against his will, given even more tasks in exchange for the forgiveness that he seeks. That is the story of the first game. It's a tragedy that tells the story of a desperate man deceived by those he thought would protect him, tricked into killing those he loves most, and having his attempt to release himself stolen from him by others who would deceive him again. Does that sound one-dimensional to you? All throughout this series, we see depth in both story and Kratos as a character. All throughout these games, we see Kratos as much more than just an angry, vengeance-hungry monster. Have we forgotten the part in the first game where he sees his family in Ares' nightmare vision, and he hugs them to protect them? Have we forgotten how Kratos carried his dead brother's body up a mountain in Ghosts of Sparta, and once again considers suicide only to ask what he has become? Is this a man of single-minded fury to you?
By the gods, what have I become?
Or what about in God of War 3, when he rescues Pandora and his fatherly instincts come out as he fights to protect her, as he reaches out to her exactly as he does in 2018 to Atreus?
This little sequence right here gives me chills, even watching it again. Let's just take a second to acknowledge it. I mean, that's just awesome. This little sequence right here gives me chills, even watching it again. Let's just take a second to acknowledge it. I mean, that's just awesome.
Kratos being a dad and being loving towards kids isn't something new, and it's weird that 2018 depicted Kratos as being so bad at it when he seemed quite natural at it in the old games. Or what about the most impactful scene in all of the classic games, when Kratos meets Calliope in Elysium in Chains of Olympus? This single scene is more crushingly sad and filled with emotion than anything in 2018. After years of service to the gods, years of fighting for forgiveness, Kratos finally reunites with his daughter Calliope in the fields of Elysium. He wants nothing more than to stay with her, but realizes that Persephone is going to destroy the world. Ultimately, he must cast Calliope aside and become the ghost of Sparta once again to kill Persephone and prevent her from destroying the world. The scene is gut-wrenching. Do you think Kratos is one-dimensional after this?
Father, please! Please!
As I said, God of War is the story of fear and redemption, not anger and vengeance. And we know this because God of War 3 literally details this. Kratos becomes a servant of the gods because he was afraid to die in battle. The gods took Deimos away because they were afraid of what he would become. The gods betrayed Kratos because they were afraid of him. Fear fueled every action and betrayal in the other games, not anger.
Kratos, fear drove Zeus to kill his father Kronos. The same fear that brought the Great War. A fear that drove Zeus to kill you, his own son. Zeus uses fear to keep you in the dark. Confront your demons and lay them to rest.
Zeus himself fell prey to the dark evils. This is why he became so enraged and obsessed with your death. He was consumed by the evil, fear.
And yet, how does Kratos act in 2018? Fearful. He's afraid to tell Atreus the truth about his past. He's afraid of what would happen to Atreus if he learned he was a god. And that fear drives Atreus away from him until the truth is revealed. Fear is what drove Freya to make Baldur invulnerable as well, creating their drama too. But this was a lesson Kratos had already learned in God of War 3. He regressed in 2018, only to learn the same morals again. What?
I let my needs, my fears, come before what he needed. And I couldn't see his resentment until it was too late.
Kratos also realized the destructive nature of vengeance in God of War 3.
My vengeance ends now.
My vengeance ends now wasn't a declaration of war against Zeus, it was an admission of his wrongdoing. Anger and vengeance wasn't what made Kratos successful in the end, it was hope. Kratos becomes the god of hope at the end of God of War 3.
Hope is what makes us strong. It is why we are here. It is what we fight with when all else is lost.
From it, you gained the strength that Zeus could never destroy. A strength great enough to overcome fear. Locked deep inside of you, Kratos, is hope.
And for the sake of conversation, let's say Kratos was one-dimensional in the original games. For the sake of conversation, let's say his only emotion was anger, and he was fueled by nothing but his thirst for vengeance. How does that make Kratos less human and less relatable? Is anger not a human emotion? Do you not feel anger? If your family was killed, would you not want to see those responsible punished? You can argue that 2018's Kratos is also one-dimensional. All he feels is sadness. His only personality trait is distrust towards the gods. Is that more human? Does his repeating boy and I do not know the entire game help you relate to him? Is sadness somehow a more real emotion than anger? No, of course not. Anger is a human emotion and shouldn't be viewed as toxic or lesser. The things people praise Kratos for, being more stoic, slower to anger, a father, breaking the cycle of vengeance, etc., are all things he either showed or learned in the classic God of War games. So yes, the Kratos we see in 2018 may be all these things, but he was also all these things, or learned to be all those things, in the classic games. So shut up about Kratos being one-dimensional in the old games. There was also potential to reflect more on the old games, and that ball was dropped in my opinion. Towards midway part of the game, Atreus falls ill, and Kratos needs to travel to Hell to get a cure for him. Unfortunately, the monsters in Hell are ice types, so Kratos' ice-type Leviathan axe is useless against them. So he needs a fire-type weapon, the Blades of Chaos, which results in the need to switch between color-coded elemental attacks for different types of enemies, similar to the mechanic in DMC Devil May Cry. Anyways, Kratos goes on a boat ride back home, where he comes in contact with Athena. He basically tells her to go away, and that's the extent of it. This would have been a great moment to explore Kratos' past from the original games. Maybe reveal he still doesn't feel forgiven over killing Calliope, and that's why he's so distant from Atreus. He can't bear to feel that loss again. Calliope isn't brought up at all in 2018. Kratos' redemption isn't brought up at all either. And when we get the Blades of Chaos, it feels so underwhelming. They're weak compared to the upgraded Leviathan axe that you've been using. This should have been a badass moment, reuniting with your old weapons, and it just felt weak to me. Not only that, but this would have been a perfect opportunity to use the classic music. A little fan service for us longtime fans of the franchise. Imagine picking up the blades, and this music kicks in, and you just go off on these guys.
But I am your monster no longer.
It would have been perfect, but no. This whole part just feels weird to me. The game goes through great lengths to separate itself from the classic games while also trying to tie its major story threads back to it, but it completely ignores the actual important, meaningful stuff from the original games in favor of pushing this anger bad, vengeance bad, I'm a dad now bullshit. I don't think everything about the story in God of War 2018 is bad. There's a lot good there, but I think there is a lot of messy stuff too, and I am sick of people disregarding, misinterpreting, or ignoring the complexities of the classic God of War games in an attempt to make 2018 somehow more respectable. The story of 2018 is fine, but it's not even on the same level as the classic games. I think many of my issues regarding this game were compounded because just a year after God of War 2018 was released, another action game came out that was essentially what I wished God of War was. A sequel to a classic PS2 game that was modernized, but also maintained swift, complex gameplay that felt and looked like the original games in that series, and also told an interesting and engaging story without open world bloat. Of course, I'm talking about Devil May Cry 5. Devil May Cry 5 is what God of War 2018 should have been. A modernized continuation of a beloved action series that started on the PS2 and had a bit of a hiatus. Devil May Cry 5 was amazing. Its combat was fast, frantic, satisfying, technical, and overall fun. There were 3 different characters to play as with different fighting styles to learn. Dante had a plethora of weapons to swap between on the fly. There were tons of combos and special moves to learn and master. It had a more versatile camera that was still third person instead of fixed, but could be turned all over to give a better view of the arena, letting you see where enemies actually were without turning your character. It had jumping, and it told a deep and personal narrative about a son, Nero, engaged in family drama with his father, Virgil. Devil May Cry 5 just smoked God of War 2018 in every way in terms of what an action game should be. It was more fun, had a better combat system, and showed that you didn't need to bow to modern AAA walkie-talkie, cinematic, or open-world RPG-like game tropes to provide a great action game experience. Again, I wish this is what God of War 2018 played like. Just look at how much better the combat is. It's especially sad because, as I said in the beginning of the video, God of War originally was heavily inspired by Devil May Cry. The devs originally set out to show Japanese devs that American devs could create a great action game experience, and now, it looks like we gave up on that. But let's get back to God of War. I have been going on for way too long now, and I feel like I'm starting to lose focus a little bit, so I'm just going to discuss a few more things and then wrap this up. First off is Niflheim. taking into all of what I said into account, Niflheim is by far the worst part of this entire game. I hate Niflheim. It's tedious, it's frustrating, it isn't fun. Niflheim is essentially an added challenge level that turns God of War into a roguelite. You have to traverse a maze filled with poison mist that slowly kills you over time, effectively giving you a time limit. Throughout the maze are traps, which the camera fucked me up and got me killed more than avoiding the traps and enemies. Clearing a room of enemies lets you open chests containing various crafting materials needed to create higher level gear. The enemy spawns, chest contents, and room locations are completely randomized every time you run it, and if you die, you lose everything you earned during your run. This shit is so tedious. It's the definition of grindy, as you do run after run to get rare crafting materials. This part is worth doing to get the Niflheim armor, which I think is the best armor in the base game, but fuck, it is so annoying and tedious. There's also a Valkyrie hidden in here, so you'll have to fight a Valkyrie with a time limit when you've already probably been severely weakened from traversing a maze full of randomly generated enemy spawns. And if you die on the Valkyrie, good luck finding her again because the room spawns are random. Fuck Niflheim. Now, the absolute best part of the game is the Valkyries. First time I fought a Valkyrie, I was like, what the hell? This is like bullshit difficult. But I really began to really like fighting the Valkyries. They provide the most challenging and intense combat experience in the game. You need to learn their moveset to be successful. You need to learn how to dodge, counter, and what attacks are useful against them. It's like a puzzle, and I really enjoyed the challenge and strategy required, and overcoming the challenges of the Valkyrie felt so rewarding. Breathing that sigh of relief every time you killed one, and I got pretty good at killing them too. They're the best parts of that one-on-one combat I mentioned during the combat section, and really push you to learn the combat mechanics to their fullest. Though the game's issue of samey mini-bosses does strike here with the Valkyries, there are 9 Valkyries to kill and they're not too different from one another, so it's essentially 9 of the same fights, which does feel like a little much. Still, I like these fights as a whole, and again, I got really good against them. That said, fuck Sigrun. Sigrun, the final Valkyrie and Queen of the Valkyries, is one of the most unfairly difficult and brutally punishing bosses I have ever played. She might actually be the hardest boss that I have ever fought against in any game. At least as far as her difficulty on Give Me God of War mode is concerned. I fought her with a maxed out Leviathan Axe and maxed out Blades of Chaos at level 8.5 with some of the best armor, gems, and gear in the games, and a maxed out Infinity Gauntlet Talisman, and she still kicked my ass. She has every move of all the other Valkyries, she's incredibly fast, she has multiple moves that could kill you in one hit, she has a move that blinds you, making dodging and countering her attacks nearly impossible, she has like 20 health bars and it takes forever to chip away at her health, it can take like 15 minutes to kill her. She also does crazy amounts of damage and leaves very little room for error. You need to fight her almost perfectly, it's insane. Many of her moves look similar too, so it really takes time and practice figuring out what she is actually going to do so you can dodge, block, or parry correctly. There are so many times I'd almost kill her just to suddenly die from a near undodgeable attack, or get flustered during a 10-minute fight and make one tiny mistake thinking her attack was actually another, and just getting melted on the spot. I died at least 100 times fighting her. I eventually killed her, and it was one of the most satisfying wins, but the gear you get from her is kind of crap, and it almost didn't feel worth it. The fight itself is fun, and again, I really liked overcoming the challenge, but the sheer bullshit behind her difficulty really resulted in the only Valkyrie fight that I can say I didn't enjoy at the end. If you think that Sigrun is a well-designed boss that is fair and not tedious, there is something wrong with you. So yeah, the Valkyries were the definite highlight of the game, showcasing the very best that the combat in this game has to offer, even if Sigrun is a big shit.
I'm grateful we were able to set the Valkyries free. So much of this has been avoided, only...
You said it yourself, Head. It does not matter anymore. The past is the past.
Well, that's awfully cheerful coming from you.
I am in a good mood. The dwarves will make use of this help.
Your dad's a wee bit single-minded, isn't he, lad?
Definitely.
Now, this video has gone on long enough, I think. I know I talked about a lot. This is a big game with a lot to unpack. There was a lot I wanted to address. So as I'm wrapping up, I just want to bring up some things I want to see in God of War Ragnarok, the new God of War game supposedly releasing this year. As it stands, I'm just going to accept the new RPG Lite thing in the new direction for this game. So I'm not just going to say, bring back the old God of War, but I'll actually give some constructive feedback. 1. The camera needs an overhaul. Something more akin to Devil May Cry 5 would be much appreciated. Don't lock it behind Kratos, let us survey the area and have more control over it. 2. Connect it more with the classic games. Bring up Calliope, bring up Pandora, show Kratos' other sides from the classic games, show that he has always been a complex character. There's a part at the end of the game where Kratos explains to Atreus where his name Atreus came from. He tells him about Sparta. It's a great moment that bridges the old games with the new, and I want to see more of this. It's to be expected that there will be more downtime and boats and traveling and whatever, so these moments would be the perfect opportunity for Kratos to talk about the events and challenges he overcame in the original games, and tell Atreus about the quests and connect to those games. I want to hear Kratos telling Atreus how he killed the Minotaur, the Kraken, the Hydras, the Basilisk, etc. How he literally climbed out of Hades and refused to be lost in the underworld. How he made the ultimate sacrifice in Elysium, casting away his daughter again for the betterment of the world. About the hope that he released when he opened Pandora's box. 3. I want them to double down on the idea of vengeance from the gods. We had this stoic, mopey Kratos in this game, let's get the badass Kratos back for the next. I really liked the role reversal that this game sets up as the gods coming to Kratos in a quest of vengeance for killing Baldur, Magni, and Modi. There's a secret ending in 2018 where Thor shows up looking for a fight. I want this to start off the next game. Start it off with a bang. Start it off with combat. It's go time. Kratos isn't having any more of your shit, and your quest for vengeance is in vain because Kratos is gonna kick your ass. Period. I'm expecting we'll see Fenrir and Hel and Atreus showing more signs of being Loki. Loki does start Ragnarok in the original Norse myths with his children Fenrir, the Great Wolf, and Jormungandr, the World Serpent. I'm sure we'll see more of how Loki became Atreus. Maybe this is all just a big trick to fuck with Kratos more. Loki is a big trickster. Anyways, I know this video was very long. If you made it through all this, thank you very much. I hope I explained everything in the way I meant to. With such a long video and, well, long series of games, I'm sure I missed something. I know I was kind of negative. I don't think God of War is a bad game. It's actually quite a good game. It's just I had a lot of issues with it, and as a longtime fan of the series, I wanted to see these issues addressed. It's still my least favorite entry in the series. Again, it's not a bad game, I just want more from God of War, and I hate how people seem to think the old games were basic button mashers with a one-note story. Anyways, that's it for this one. I hope you liked it. Again, thanks for watching this whole video. I don't expect to make a video this long again for a while. Remember to like and subscribe if you liked it. Share this video around. Comment saying how stupid I am and that God of War 2018 is a masterpiece and I'm just a nostalgic boomer. Appreciate you. Stay toasty. Until next time, I need a nap. God of War.